Good morning. I was honoured to be asked by John Nikita Best to review his work and to present to you this morning with my assessment of it. I have to say I found it a very stimulating experience to reflect on John Nikita's work and my own and to look at the similarities and differences. If his intention in undertaking this work was to secure a place in discussions about responsible tourism, I can assure him that he has achieved that. I thought it might be desirable, for John Nikita's sake as much as for anything else, to give my initial response to some of the key questions I was asked so that John Nikita can then enjoy the rest of this presentation. Let me say that his work is clearly original and relevant, and it's definitely got the potential to inform curriculum development, thinking about governance and responsible destination practice. The work does maintain scholarly rigour, pluralism, and it's non-doctrinal in its positioning. It is globally applicable within Christian and plural systems. It is engaging policy relevant scholarship, I think, at the intersection of ethics, governance, and national development. It is moving the ethical foundations of responsible tourism beyond the managerial and technical models, which we'll look at shortly. It is grounding responsibility within enduring ethical and educational frameworks, although I have to say that the endurance of different ethical frameworks is, I think, in a state of flux at the moment around the world. It certainly invited scholarly reflection, and I thank John Nikita for the influence he's had on my thinking over the last few days. And I particularly like the learning objectives and discussion questions that John has produced as part of this. Just briefly on the ICRT Global, which does have a West Africa presence in the ICRT West Africa, which is based out of Itog in the Gambia. Our objective in the ICRTs around the world is to build on the shoulders of giants, just as Newton referred to in 1675. We find those giants through the Responsible Tourism Awards, and then we share the knowledge that we get from working with them, essentially through 5 mechanisms. We have the World Responsible Tourism Awards. We have professional training courses, which we're still adding to, which are postmasters level, designed for mid-career professionals. These are short, intensive, distance learning courses, very reasonably priced, if I may say so. We cooperate with others and run some ourselves, conferences and workshops. We're heavily engaged in knowledge sharing and particularly keen to encourage sharing of knowledge between the countries of the South in order to speed progress towards responsible tourism around the global South. Effectively, we are supporting change makers, recognizing that there is no standard blueprint, no internationally valid prescription for how tourism should be made more sustainable, because the salience and the importance of different issues varies from place to place, affected by the cultural and natural environment. And if the problems vary, so do the solutions. What we have in common, however, is a desire to tackle those problems, to take responsibility for making tourism better. In terms of the tourism curriculum, I think John Nikita is correct to point to its narrow technical focus. That's true of the curriculum generally, as I've seen it around the world. It is relatively highly siloed. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's happening in other sectors. And I'm always surprised by how little knowledge there is of the tragedy of the commons work, which exists in conservation and anthropology and a number of other disciplines, but not much in tourism. And we talk about sustainability in rather a lax way without really worrying too much about how we're going to define it. has very little treatment of ethics in most tourism courses. And yet, I would argue that fundamental to success in responsible tourism is a whole of government approach where the different parts of government is able to work with business and the community to make significant change. And of course, that's much easier to do if you've got a shared values framework to inform your partnership in making those changes. Sustainable development has got a long history now, dating back to 72. By 2002, I was increasingly frustrated about the lack of progress and keen to find a different language to talk about changing tourism in order to make it more sustainable. This diagram is intended just very briefly to explain the origins. I'd done some work in the 1990s with the Association of Independent Tour Operators and come up with responsible tourism. I'd been asked to look at ethical tourism, but that wasn't thought to be practical by the independent tour operators because if they, for example, if any of the hotels they were using served meat on the menu, there'd be people who were vegan or vegetarian who would say that that was unethical. So it was too narrow a definition. We adopted, therefore, the language of responsibility where people could say what they were taking responsibility for, why they were taking responsibility, and what they'd done and what they'd achieved. At the same time, in South Africa, the first post-apartheid white paper on tourism was published in 96, and that talked about responsible tourism. Those two things came together in the 2002 Cape Town conference, which ran alongside the World Summit on Sustainable Development that year in Johannesburg, and resulted in the Declaration on Responsible Tourism in Destinations, which was really the founding document of the current responsible tourism movement. There was some intellectual origins of that in Krippendorf's work with the holidaymakers, and I've published a couple of books since. 2004 brought the Responsible Tourism Awards, launched at WTM in London, and 2024, the launch of the ICRT Global. The biggest change was probably 2022 when we did the Charter on Responsible Tourism, which was signed on Magna Carta Island. And that really had the benefit of 20 years' experience of working on responsible tourism to enable us to shorten and make more concise the statement of what responsible tourism is. It's a lot more deep detail in the original Cape Town Declaration than the one side of A4 Charter published in 2022. It is really the major document informing the work of the ICRT Global. Fundamentally, the question is, for any community, any politician, is this community going to use tourism or is it going to be used by it? And the way the community uses tourism ideally would be through meaningful connections, creating better understanding between the hosts and guests, between the tourists and the local community, and one which is culturally sensitive based on respect and building local pride and confidence. So in terms of the responsible tourism movement currently, the argument for taking responsibility is based on secular ethics, defining right and wrong based on human reason, on values of empathy, the application of logic, and shared experience, hence partly the importance of sharing experience between destinations and local communities. But it's also about emphasizing human well-being and promoting human well-being through social harmony and ethical living in a world through secular values like compassion and justice. Of course, these are not the only values which might lead you to adopt responsibility, but it is about taking responsibility and achieving sustainable development. It's about what you do individually and collectively, and the test is not the language you use, but what you actually do and what you achieve. So why the word responsible? There's couple of reasons. I think one is that it contains both the two different aspects. The one is of accountability and blame and legal liability. The other is responsibility, the opportunity to stand up and make a difference through partnerships and relationships. And it's that which people find often more attractive than simply being held legally liable. The ethics has to be evidenced through behaviour and the outcomes. And these are partnerships based on equality, mutual benefit, collaboration, mutual respect, community leadership, underpinned by transparency and honesty in what is being done. I found the work of Edith Sizou on responsibility in cultures around the world particularly useful. And it is the case that the word is generally composed of the two parts, the responsibility of blame and legal liability, but also the responsibility, the opportunity to step up and be responsible in any particular circumstance. The other thing I'd say about responsibility is most of us have two intensive periods of education in the concept. The one when we're children, our parents berate us for not being responsible, and we debate whether our behaviour is responsible or not with our parents. And then, of course, as parents, when we're on the other side of the same argument with our own children. This language also fits very well with UNWTO, which in its Global Code of Ethics for Tourism in 1999 talked about the understanding and promotion of the ethical values common to humanity, with an attitude of tolerance and respect for the diversity of religious, philosophical, and moral beliefs as the foundation and the consequence of responsible tourism. And I think that's one of the founding principles, really, of the responsible tourism movement. And I just wanted to remind us of Lincoln, because in the context of a world beginning to face now the very real challenges of climate change and what it means for agriculture and livelihoods, it was Lincoln who said, "You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today." And unfortunately, there's way too much evasion today. I was very interested to be caused to think again about the Garden of Eden and its role in Genesis. Um, I think one of the key problems is the tragedy of the commons, which Gareth Hardin wrote most eloquently about in 1968. That the tragedy is that each one of us is locked into a system that makes us want to increase our herd without limit in a world that is limited. You see that in tourism, where more and more people want to go to Venice, more and more tour operators want to take people to Venice, more and more airlines want to take people to Venice. But the consequence of too many people going to Venice is that the place is changed out of almost all recognition. And as Harding puts it, freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. Venice is a commons. There's nothing to stop you going there. You might pay a small entry charge. But the trouble is, Venice is overgrazed as a tourism place. I would just like to point out that Aristotle first noticed this problem in 350 BCE. This is not a new problem. It's one that we have struggled with as a species for literally thousands of years without actually being able to really make much progress in dealing with it. As I wrote back in 2014, the individual pursuit of self-interest does not necessarily result in the common good, and moreover, in a finite world, may result in ruin for all of us. The word responsible comes up in Indian languages, again with the same balance of answering, dealing with the problem, but also the burden of the task. Both are there. This image is from Kerala, of a local person involved in a piece of religious Hindu art, with a tourist there in a position of complete equality, learning from the teacher, sat on the floor with the teacher, learning something of the local culture and its religious heritage in a very participative and equal sense. It's worth adding that Kerala has a plurality of religions. It has Christianity and Hinduism and some Islam as well within it. Um, be interesting to see what the response of the ICRT India is, particularly in Kerala, to John Latika's work. I also wanted to point to the African tradition of Ubuntu. I am because you are. That notion that Ubuntu's social values of solidarity, coexistence, respect, and cooperation among students has informed a piece of pedagogical writing, which John Nikita and I might discuss in the context of his work in a recorded seminar presentation at some point in the future. I think the pointing to civilizational ethics, which comes out of this piece of work by John Nikita, is important. I had a quick look at Google, and there are over 5 million references to ethics on Google. Only 72,700 to civilizational ethics. That's just 1.2% of the total. And I think there would be value in emphasizing the civilizational values of the civilizational ethical values of responsible tourism. And as John Nikita has pointed out, particularly in the context of stewardship, hospitality, justice, and human dignity. And I just put in the photograph at the bottom there to, which is actually the Maison Dieu in Faversham, where I live. It's a pilgrimage hostel on the route between London and Canterbury, much used by pilgrims in the Middle Ages. And another example of the fact that tourism is not an entirely new phenomenon, although we tend to see it in that way. I think on the issue of Christianity, I should be clear that I'm culturally Christian rather than actually a believer. But I do think the Eden metaphor is important, not because it's a theological assertion, but because it's a metaphor that enables critical discussion about the design of destinations which present themselves as Eden. So I think perhaps we should take that aspect up rather more within the responsible tourism movement than we have done so far to date. Genesis, I think, does provide a coherent narrative framework that addresses the origin, responsibility, and interaction with space and moral order, and enables us to address the issue of the tragedy of the commons in a way that will make sense to, I'm sure, lots of people. As John Nikita has pointed out, Genesis is a narrative case study and one which could be used to engender a debate. And I like very much his use of discussion points related to this. I think there's a rich opportunity there for teachers of tourism in universities and colleges, perhaps in schools, to use that framework. The reasons for taking responsibility are many, and this is the business case that I use very frequently in my work. But you'll see at the top there, it is mainly because it's the right thing to do for this and future generations. And many main board directors of big companies have said to me that they've discovered, for example, the importance of waste management from conversations with their grandchildren. Enlightened self-interest is the secular perspective. And John Donne's poem No Man is an Island makes the point, I think, relating back to Ubuntu. We have so much to do together that we can't afford to be divided on these issues, and there is every opportunity for a pluralistic approach of the sort that John Nikita is evidencing in his work. I wanted to end with this really about the secular ethics of responsible tourism. If one has knowledge and agency, the opportunity and capacity to act, to take responsibility, then one should. There's an arguable ethical obligation in this. And within a discourse of responsibility, there is a stronger imperative to respond and to act. If the issue and capacity to act is established, then failure to act can be attacked as irresponsible. In the discourse of responsibility, there's a stronger imperative to take responsibility than to act, because failure to do so when others are doing so is to risk being labelled irresponsible. And most of us don't want to be labelled irresponsible. And finally, a point that was made to a group of my students by a UK tour operator in a one-day workshop with him. He said, responsibility is free. We can take as much of it as we can handle. Of course, handling it involves a lot of effort, sometimes emotional stress, sometimes conflict, but certainly it involves work. But on the other hand, it's free. You can take as much of it as you can handle. And finally, just to say thank you, to ask you to spread the word about our Responsible Tourism Awards, which this year are in 6 categories, and to say thank you for this opportunity. I've been very stimulated by it, and I thank John Nikita for asking me. Thank you.